Hello and welcome. Today I am going to be bringing you guys a review of Boys in the Valley by Philip Fracassi. So this is horror. This is a horror book. I do not often delve into horror due to, especially adult horror. I love middle grade horror. There's something that's just so amazing about it, and I know what it is for me. And it has to do with the fact that it focuses more on creating a scary entity and focusing on the plot of the story. And there isn't a bunch of gratuitous sex and an overabundance of gore. Now, when I do delve into adult horror, I'm very, very picky about it. But this was one that the minute I heard what it was compared to, I was like, I want to read that. So this book is, in its advertising, is comped as The Exorcist meets Lord of the Flies. Now, one of my favorite classics of all time is Lord of the Flies. I'm sorry, I enjoyed that one. I know it's not a lot of other people's favorites, but I personally enjoyed that when I read it back in high school. The whole idea of a bunch of boys living on an island together that end up turning on each other and killing each other, I was like, this is good stuff. So that's essentially what this is, only instead of it taking place on an island, obviously, these boys are up in a remote area. They are orphans. They live at the orphanage of St. Vincent's Church. And then what happens in the middle of the night, a man shows up, and next thing they know, all the boys are turning on each other, they're killing each other, and all these things. So trigger warnings. Considering this story involves children, from what I was able to gather, the ages range from 5 to 16. The oldest is 16. The youngest that was stated with an age is 5. There is child death in this book. I feel like that should be a given, considering, you know, the synopsis tells you they start killing each other. So yes, there is on-page child death. Yes, it is descriptive. It is part of the story. The other trigger warning that I would like to give is there is animal death. That one is not in the synopsis. That one did kind of throw me a little bit. I'm not a person who has a problem with animal death on page, honestly. But I know for other people, like my best friend, for instance, that is an instant, nope, she's done. The minute she reads something about an animal dying, she will put the book down and never walk towards it again. And I know there's others that are like that. So I just wanted to put that out there, that there is two scenes about animal death. So now Boys in the Valley starts out really strong. The very first prologue chapter, you're like, oh my god. There's no holding back based off of that first chapter. And then it kind of like slows down a little bit, and then it kind of slows down a bit, and then it builds and it builds. And I think that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about it most, was that like it built and it built and it built, and it works off of short chapters. Like some of these chapters are like 3 pages long, and I think that actually worked in its favor because it kept you glued to the story. Because I read this in one whole day yesterday. Yeah, I read this in one whole day. I would take breaks here and there because, you know, I don't want to mess up my eyes more than they already are. But I just every time I put it down, I would walk away for about an hour, and then I'd be like, I need to go back. I need to go back to it. So it's written in a manner that it keeps you compelled, and it keeps pulling you in, because you're just like, I want to see what happens. When does it happen? How does it happen? And it's split into 3 parts. I believe it's 3 parts, and each part gets more explosive than the last one. Like, that's the best way to explain it. It gets more explosive than the last one, and I actually really kind of liked that, because you would finish a part, and then the next part you'd be like, oh my god, like like it would just like the stakes would like kick up each part, and you were just like, oh my god. And it wasn't like a slow build up each part. It was kind of like each part was just like, boom, here's the next step, and you're like, oh, okay. Now there is a lot of religious elements throughout this, because like I said, the boys live in an orphanage that is on the Christian Church of St. Vincent's. So there is a lot of religious stuff in it, and it's one of those things where it barters on both sides, where you see there's a father who clearly has a need for control. He has this need to control these boys, and he weaponizes God to control these boys. And, you know, he does very horrible, heinous things to these boys, you know, locking them in a hole in the ground outside, to, you know, beating their hands numerous times with a stick, starving them essentially. And then you have the other father who doesn't agree with the things that the other father is doing, but because he's a lower rank, he can't really do anything about it. So you see both sides, where you see the father who's like, no, like, we need to treat them well, like, they're kids, like, we shouldn't be starving them, we shouldn't be hitting them, we shouldn't be throwing them in holes for punishment. And then you have the other one who's like, no, this is how we do it because you have to control them. And he's just like, so I did like that aspect. I like that aspect that you got to see two different sides of men who are involved in religion. And then there is a third adult. Well, there's technically 4 adults throughout the whole book. The fourth one, you just kind of like, he's like there. Because he's old. He's just there. But the other one, the third one, he's actually there on punishment. He has to spend the rest of he did something, and he has to serve at the church as a brother. That's his punishment. And he's one of those characters where he flips back and forth. Like, sometimes he's in agreement with the father, who is like, we have to beat the kids to get them to learn, we have to use God as a weapon to get them to learn. And then there's other times where he flips and he's like, this is a bit much, like, they're kids, like, I feel like we're going too far. So I was kind of interesting seeing, like, the double side for that particular character, because, like, one minute you're like, oh, this guy is terrible, and the next you're like, maybe he's not that bad, but then he's like, oh no, he is that bad, and then you're like, he's not. You know, so, you know, I did like that. You get to meet a majority of the boys. It does follow particular small little group of them in particular, but I did feel like there was enough of them to really get a good feel of how many different boys were supposedly in this house, this orphanage, because there was about 30 of them. And I do think enough of them got enough page screen time to, like, really get to, like, know and understand how these kids worked. It did mostly follow the oldest and his journey, because he gets, you know, he's been living there the longest with this current set and everything, and so he has taken on, like, a very older brother role for a lot of these boys. Now, when the actual, like, horror aspect starts to come into this, it deals with possession. That's the whole Exorcist half of the story, because, like I said, it's comped as Exorcist meets Lord of the Flies. And it so deals with possession, and it's one of those things where it's kind of like instantaneously, like, when you see it come in, you know, there's people out doing, you know, worshiping Satan and the devil and stuff like that, and now, like, these horrible things are happening. And the way that Fracassi, like, builds up the moment when you know the possession has released itself into the house and has potentially infected the boys, it was dramatic. It's, like, to say the least. Like, it was dramatic, and it was done really well. And it was just kind of like one of those scenes where, like, it happens. Like, if it was a movie and it would happen, you'd be like, that's the moment, isn't it? That's the moment. But everybody in the story, it takes them longer to realize that that was the moment. And, you know, then it turns into, like, the adults trying to hide from the kids what's going on, but, like, the kids are acting weird. They're starting to do strange things. Kids who don't normally hang out together are now hanging out together. You know, they're all walking around with these creepy little smiles on their faces, and they all start rebelling and doing these horrible things. Like, when the first actual death happened to one of the children, I was like, this is, holy moly, this is, oh my god. Like, I just kind of, like, because, like I said, it does get descriptive when dealing with how these kids are dying. So if you can't deal with descriptive child death, I absolutely do not recommend this for you. But yeah, Fracassi does not skimp out on the details, but what I also like is he doesn't go over the top either. It's not to the point to where it's so gratuitous that you're just like, this is dumb. He's found the perfect balance on his gruesome, gory scenes that I was more enthralled than I was disgusted. Like, I mean, I was disgusted. Like, there's a part of you that's going to be disgusted because you're just, these kids are doing absolutely horrible, heinous things to one another, and you're just like, they're children. They're between 5 and 16. They're children, you know. But at the same time, like, for me, I was just like, I need to see what happens next. And for me, it was more so, I wanted to know how they were going to get out of this, if they were going to get out of this, how many were going to survive, how they were going to survive. And just the stakes, they build up and they build up and they build up. And then once it like explodes and all these kids are just mobbing each other and just, they're like stabbing each other, hitting each other with hammers. Like, it's wild. And you're just like, oh my God. And like, he uses the mob mentality really, really well, especially the fact that these are small children that are basically starved. So they're, not only are they young, but they're also skinny. So many of them are like skin and bones because this head priest was just like, you're gonna starve today because you didn't wash your hands. So these children like use mob mentality to overthrow the adults, and it was insane. And so I like that he included that. Like, it wasn't just like these kids just like magically became like strong or something because they were possessed or whatever. I mean, there was a few possession scenes where I was like, we need to do something about that. we need to do something about that, because last I checked, humans don't crawl on the ceiling. But he really utilized the mob mentality idea and used that to his advantage. And of course, there was the ringleader behind it all, which he used perfectly as well. And it's not really, and like, it's one of those things where it's like, you as the reader, you can see the ringleader, and everybody else in the story can't, because they're just like, oh, everyone's just acting a little weird, it's just a little strange right now, the storm is coming, it's fine. But yeah, the final, like, the big final event was, it was insane the way it all played out. But the thing is the very final page of the last chapter was absolutely so bittersweet that it made me cry. That's all. Like, you watch these boys struggle and struggle and struggle and just try and do the right thing and try and get out of this situation and such, and the way it ended, you were just like, because like, it's like I said, it's one of those things where it's like, on one hand you're happy, and on the other hand you're like, well, okay, I see. And it hurts. It hurts. So definitely for me, this was 5 stars all the way through, from being compelled to having to want to read it from start to finish. I like I said, I read it in one day. The balance, the fact that it didn't feel overly gratuitous in the gore aspect, but it was also enough to where you know you're reading a horror book. Like, there's just, am I making sense? Like, you get to that point where you're just like, when it deals with horror, I expect a certain level of gore, and some authors take it a bit too far for me. I feel like Fracassi has a great balance of how much he included in it, with storyline on top of that, and not having to just overgo it and just really just drive into the nastiness of it. But a lot of it was more so just the different elements that he used to help create the fear throughout the story. Now, I will say, the whole time I was reading it, I wasn't exactly scared. I was more like enthralled, because I wanted to see how everything was going to play out. And I was more just like, which kid is next? That kind of mentality. And then as you go further into the story of when the boys are starting to attack each other, more and more of the possession storyline starts to come through and it starts to bring its head up and everything. So yeah, it's really good. It's worth reading if you can handle child death. If not, I absolutely do not recommend it for you. So if you like horror and you don't have those triggers, I definitely recommend Boys in the Valley. It is definitely worth your time. And the comp comparisons are spot on, personally, if you ask me. It's not often that I think the comparison books that are chosen for a new release or whatever are good. This particular one, it's a perfect match. In my personal opinion, it's a perfect match. So that is my review of Boys in the Valley. And if you like this, if you've read this, you could drop a comment below if it sounds interesting to you, anything like that, you know, comments, likes, subscribes, all of those great things. And I will talk to you next time. Bye.